Welcome to week 5. Over the past few weeks, we've explored the many forms of work that women have performed in factories, homes, hospitals, and garment shops. This week, we shift our focus from working to organizing. We'll examine why the 1930s became one of the most important decades in American labor history and why so many women became active in unions and in strikes. So, to really understand this, we have to start with the Great Depression. When the stock market crashed in October of 1929, it triggered an economic crisis unlike anything most Americans had experienced. By 1933, nearly 25% of the workforce was unemployed. In some industrial cities, unemployment was even higher. Families lost their homes to foreclosure, banks failed, and many people lost their life savings overnight. Bread lines stretched for blocks, and charitable organizations struggled to meet demand. Some families moved into makeshift communities called Hoovervilles, named sarcastically after President Herbert Hoover, who many blamed for the nation's problems. For those who still had jobs, life wasn't necessarily much better. Employers often cut wages, reduced hours, and eliminated benefits. In many factories, workers feared that complaining about conditions would simply get them fired and replaced by someone desperate for work. Women faced additional challenges, unsurprisingly. During the Depression, many Americans argued that jobs should belong to men because they were assumed to be primary breadwinners. Some school districts and businesses even adopted policies refusing to hire married women or firing women whose husbands had jobs. This ignored the reality that millions of women were helping support their families or were the sole wage earners in their household. At the same time, many of the jobs available to women, retail, garment work, domestic service, food service, and clerical work, paid significantly less than jobs traditionally held by men. Women were expected to accept low wages because their income was often viewed as extra rather than essential, even when it clearly wasn't. Yet something remarkable happened during the 1930s. Instead of becoming more passive, many workers became more willing to organize. One reason was changing federal policy. In 1935, Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act, often called the Wagner Act. For the first time, the federal government officially recognized workers' right to form unions and bargain collectively. Employers still resisted unionization, of course, but workers now had stronger legal protections than ever before. And across the country, strikes increased dramatically. One of the most famous was the Flint sit-down strike of 1936 and 37. Rather than walking off the job, workers occupied General Motors factories. By staying inside, they prevented the company from bringing in replacement workers or moving valuable equipment. The strike lasted 44 days and eventually forced General Motors to recognize the United Auto Workers Union. It became one of the most important victories in American labor history and inspired similar actions across the country. Another major strike occurred in Akron, Ohio, where rubber workers also used sit-down tactics to pressure employers. Textile workers, longshoremen, and hotel employees organized throughout the decade, demonstrating that labor activism was spreading into many different industries. What's especially important for our course is that women participated in all of these movements, not just in traditionally female occupations, but also in industries which historians have often described as male-dominated. This week's reading by Dana Frank examines one example from the retail industry. While department stores and five and dime stores might not seem like obvious places for labor activism, they employed thousands of young women who worked long hours for relatively low pay. Retail workers dealt not only with difficult managers, but often demanding customers, making emotional labor an important part of the job long before scholars had coined that term. So, as you read, pay attention to why workers believed collective action was necessary. What made organizing worth the risks? What strategies helped workers gain public support? And how did ideas about femininity shape the way that women protested? The short films you'll watch broaden the story. Rather than focusing on a single strike, they introduce women who organized in different industries and different communities. As you watch, notice that labor activism involved much more than simply walking a picket line. It required public speaking, fundraising, coalition building, negotiating with employers, supporting families during strikes, and convincing coworkers that change was possible. One thing that often surprises people is how creative these movements could be. Workers organized rallies, wrote songs, printed newsletters, held educational meetings, and developed networks of mutual aid to support families during long strikes. Labor organizing was not simply about demanding higher wages, it was also about building communities and imagining a more democratic workplace. And so, as you move through this week's materials, keep this question in mind. What makes ordinary people decide the risk of organizing are worth taking? During the Great Depression, workers risked losing jobs they desperately needed. Some were arrested, others were blacklisted and struggled to find future employment. Yet thousands still chose to organize because they believed that remaining silent carried its own risks. By the end of the week, you'll see that labor victories are rarely achieved by a single charismatic leader. More often, they are won by groups of ordinary workers who decide to act together.